I'm afraid not, Mr. Fitch.
It's quite all right. All right. As a matter of fact, I was,
Hollywood has always had a complicated relationship with alcohol. The studios kept fully stocked bars on the lot. Directors poured drinks between takes, and the industry's social life ran on a current of cocktails that never quite stopped flowing. But for some of the biggest names in the business, the drinking didn't stop when the cameras rolled. Here are 10 old Hollywood stars who were always drunk on set, and the stories behind them are wilder than anything they ever put on screen. Number 10, W.C. Fields. W.C. Fields did not merely drink on set. He built an entire infrastructure to ensure that drinking on set was never interrupted by anything as inconvenient as studio policy. He carried a thermos he described as containing pineapple juice and grapefruit juice. It contained gin. He stashed bottles in his dressing room, in prop furniture, in locations on the lot that only he knew about. When a director asked him to stop drinking during production, Fields reportedly considered the request carefully and then continued drinking. Born William Claude Dukenfield in Darby, Pennsylvania on January 29, 1880, Fields had run away from home at 11 after a physical altercation with his father and spent his teenage years as an itinerant juggler, sleeping in parks and developing a performing act that took him from Atlantic City boardwalks to vaudeville theaters to international stages before he was 25. He was performing for royalty in Europe while still a young man, and by the time he arrived in Hollywood in the early 1920s, he had already been famous for a decade. His film persona, the misanthropic, child-hating, pompously dishonest confidence man who was reliably undone by his own appetites, was not entirely invented. Fields genuinely disliked most people, genuinely distrusted banks to the degree that he reportedly kept money in accounts under assumed names across multiple cities, and drank with a consistency and volume that his colleagues documented with both admiration and exasperation. He worked for Paramount through the 1930s in a series of films. It's a Gift in 1934, The Man on the Flying Trapeze in 1935, You Can't Cheat an Honest Man in 1939, that were built specifically around his persona and that required him to be present, functional, and funny on demand. He managed all three while remaining reliably intoxicated, which his directors eventually accepted as an operating condition rather than a problem to be solved. He was diagnosed with severe cirrhosis in the late 1930s. He stopped drinking for a period under doctor's orders, found the experience so disagreeable that he resumed and continued working with increasing physical difficulty through the early 1940s. He made Never Give a Sucker an Even Break in 1941, a film so chaotic in its construction that Universal reportedly could not determine from the script what it was supposed to be, and that Fields delivered as a series of tangentially connected set pieces that the studio released with visible uncertainty about how to market it, and then largely retired from film. His final years were spent at a rented house in Pasadena with his companion Carlotta Monti, who cared for him through his physical decline, and later wrote her own memoir about the experience. He had accumulated a fortune over his career, and true to the character he had always played, did not entirely trust any institution to hold it safely. He kept significant sums in accounts across multiple cities under assumed names, a habit that made the settlement of his estate considerably more complicated than it needed to be. W.C. Fields died on December 25, 1940, Christmas Day, which he had always professed to loathe, in Pasadena, California, at the age of 66, from a gastric hemorrhage complicated by cirrhosis. Number 9. John Barrymore. John Barrymore was considered by many of his contemporaries to be the greatest stage actor of his generation. His performance as Hamlet in 1922, which ran for 101 consecutive performances on Broadway before transferring to London, was described by critics as definitively settling the question of who held the title. He had the profile, the voice, the technical command, and the instinctive understanding of Shakespeare's language that the role required. He also drank at a rate that made his continued professional functionality a source of constant anxiety for everyone who employed him. Born John Sidney Blyth in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, on February 15, 1882, Barrymore came from the most celebrated theatrical family in America. His parents, Morris Barrymore and Georgiana Drew Barrymore, were both prominent stage performers, and his siblings Lionel and Ethel both became major film stars in their own right. The family talent was exceptional. The family relationship with alcohol was equally consistent across all three siblings, though John expressed it most completely. His transition to film produced work of genuine quality. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in 1920, Don Juan in 1926, Grand Hotel in 1932, alongside Greta Garbo and Joan Crawford. By the 1930s, the drinking had progressed to the point where his memory for lines, once considered extraordinary, the kind of photographic retention that allowed him to deliver a full Hamlet without a prompt, could no longer be relied upon. Directors on his later films began using cue cards posted around the set in his eye line, an accommodation that became standard practice across his final years of film work, and that he reportedly found neither embarrassing nor worth discussing. He worked for RKO and other studios through the late 1930s, in films that cast him primarily on the strength of his name and his remaining physical presence. His personal life had the same quality of accumulated wreckage as his professional one: 4 marriages, the loss of his Bella Vista estate in the Hollywood Hills to creditors, and a final period working a radio program that required him to be carried to the studio on some occasions. John Barrymore died on May 29, 1942, in Hollywood, California, at the age of 60, from a combination of cirrhosis, kidney failure, and pneumonia. His friend Errol Flynn reportedly arranged for his body to be propped up in a chair at a party after his death, a story that has circulated since 1942 with varying levels of confirmation, and that, regardless of its literal accuracy, captures something true about the milieu in which both men operated. Number 8. Veronica Lake. Veronica Lake's career was one of the most compressed in Hollywood history, a period of approximately 4 years, from 1941 to 1944, during which she was one of the most recognizable faces in American cinema, followed by a decline so swift that by the early 1950s, she was working as a cocktail waitress in New York and was recognized by a reporter who wrote about the encounter in terms that Lake found more humiliating than sympathetic. Born Constance Frances Marie Ockelman in Brooklyn, New York, on November 14, 1922, she was signed to Paramount in 1940 and created the peekaboo hairstyle, one side of her long blonde hair falling over her right eye, that became so widely imitated during the war years that the United States government formally requested she change it, on the grounds that female factory workers were catching their hair in machinery while trying to replicate the look. She complied temporarily, putting her hair up for a public service film, and then returned to the style that had made her image. Her films with Alan Ladd, This Gun for Hire in 1942, The Glass Key in 1942, The Blue Dahlia in 1946, were among the most commercially successful crime films of the decade. Lake and Ladd were roughly the same height at around 5'2", which created a visual equality between them that was unusual for the era and that audiences responded to with consistent enthusiasm. Her drinking created specific on-set problems that were documented by crew members across multiple productions. She would arrive having already been drinking, require significant preparation time before cameras could roll, and lose continuity between takes in ways that created editing difficulties. Directors and producers accommodated her increasing unreliability because she remained commercially valuable enough to justify the accommodation. When she ceased to be commercially valuable, When the box office numbers stopped supporting the cost of managing her, the accommodation ended rapidly and completely. Paramount declined to renew her contract in 1948. The following decade unfolded with a series of low-budget productions, failed marriages. She was married 4 times, to art director John Detley, to Hungarian director André de Toth, to songwriter Joseph McCarthy Jr., and to British restaurateur Robert Carlton Munro, and the cocktail waitress period in New York that the press covered with the particular relish reserved for the fallen famous. Her later life involved further marriages, further drinking, and a period of genuine poverty that was documented by the press with little sympathy. She worked in regional theater, appeared occasionally in low-budget films, and wrote a memoir, Veronica, published in 1971, that addressed her alcoholism with the candor of someone who had processed it thoroughly. Veronica Lake died on July 7, 1973, in Burlington, Vermont, at the age of 50, from hepatitis complicated by acute renal failure. Number 7. Errol Flynn. Errol Flynn's drinking was so much a part of his public persona that it was difficult, even at the time, to separate the myth from the man. He cultivated the image of someone who drank heroically, fought enthusiastically, and charmed everyone in the room with equal ease. And the image was, on its most basic level, accurate. He did drink heroically. He also worked, and the combination of the two produced a particular kind of on-set chaos that directors either embraced or endured. Born in Hobart, Tasmania, on June 20, 1909, Flynn had arrived in Hollywood in 1935 and become a star within a year. His early Warner Brothers films, Captain Blood, The Adventures of Robin Hood, The Seahawk, were made during a period when his drinking was heavy but functional. He was present, athletic, and capable of delivering the physical performances that the roles required. Director Michael Curtis, who made several of his most significant films, found Flynn exasperating and indispensable in roughly equal measure. By the mid-1940s, the balance had shifted. His co-stars began scheduling their scenes with awareness of what time of day Flynn would be most manageable. His afternoon availability was considerably more reliable than his morning availability, a fact that his directors rotated their shooting schedules around. The physical deterioration that accompanied his drinking became visible on screen by the late 1940s. The face that had launched 1,000 adventure films showing the specific aging that sustained alcohol use produces. He continued writing. His autobiography, My Wicked, Wicked Ways, published posthumously in 1959, is one of the most entertaining memoirs produced by any Hollywood figure of the era, and working in smaller productions through the 1950s. His final film, Cuban Rebel Girls in 1959, was made in Cuba during the final months of the Batista regime and released the year he died. Errol Flynn died on October 14, 1959, in Vancouver, British Columbia, at the age of 50. The coroner noted his body showed the physical deterioration of a man 2 decades older. Number 6. Diana Barrymore. Diana Barrymore inherited the family talent and the family susceptibility to alcohol in approximately equal measure. She was the daughter of John Barrymore and his second wife, the poet and socialite Michael Strange. Born Diana Blanche Blythe Barrymore on March 3, 1921 in New York City, and she grew up largely without her father's presence, raised by her mother in a social world that moved between New York society and European travel with no fixed domestic foundation. She signed with Universal Pictures in 1942 and appeared in a series of films, Between Us Girls in 1942, Nightmare in 1942, Frontier Badman in 1943, that the studio used to capitalize on her famous name without particularly investing in her development as an actress. The Barrymore name carried weight with audiences, and Universal deployed it accordingly without examining too closely whether the performances justified the billing. The results were mixed in proportion to the investment. Her drinking on set created problems that Universal managed with diminishing patience across the brief period of her studio career. She would arrive visibly impaired, lose track of scenes mid-take, and require retakes at a rate that production schedules could not absorb indefinitely. She was also reportedly difficult to reach between productions, not in the way of a star with social obligations, but in the way of someone whose relationship with ordinary reliability had broken down. Her autobiography, Too Much, Too Soon, published in 1957, was one of the most candid accounts of alcohol dependency, Hollywood dysfunction, and inherited self-destruction produced in the post-war period. The title captured both the trajectory of her career and the trajectory of the Barrymore family's relationship with excess across generations. It was adapted into a film in 1958, with Dorothy Malone playing Diana and Errol Flynn, who had his own significant relationship with alcohol to draw on, playing her father, John Barrymore. The casting had an accuracy that went beyond the physical resemblance. She was married 3 times, to actor Bramwell Fletcher, to tennis player John Howard, and to actor Robert Wilcox. And none of those marriages survived the combination of her drinking and the instability it produced around her. She worked in theater in her later years, attempting periodic recoveries that did not hold long enough to rebuild what had been lost. Diana Barrymore died on January 25, 1960 in New York City at the age of 38 from an overdose of alcohol and sleeping pills. Number 5. Richard Burton. Richard Burton was educated at Oxford on a scholarship, had been identified as one of the most gifted stage actors of his generation before he was 25, and made a series of decisions about his career and his life that the people who identified that gift spent the following decades watching with a mixture of admiration and grief. The drinking was central to all of it. Born Richard Walter Jenkins Jr. in Pontrydyffryn, Wales, on November 10, 1925, Burton had grown up the 12th of 13 children of a coal miner and had been effectively adopted by his school teacher Philip Burton, whose surname he eventually took, who recognized his ability and arranged the scholarship that changed the direction of his life. His stage work in the late 1940s and early 1950s convinced the serious theater world that he was the natural heir to Olivier. His film work convinced the studios that he was commercially valuable. His drinking convinced both that working with him involved a specific set of calculations. His on-set behavior during the filming of Cleopatra in Rome in 1962, during which he and Elizabeth Taylor began the affair that became one of the most publicized relationships in Hollywood history, was shaped throughout by his drinking. Directors reported his arrival times varying by hours. His memory for lines remained remarkable even when his physical condition was not, which was one of the qualities that made him simultaneously maddening and irreplaceable on a production. His 2 marriages to Taylor, 1964 to 1974, and again briefly from 1975 to 1976, were both conducted in the specific atmosphere that 2 people who drink heavily together create: intensely loving, intensely combustible, and structured around a mutual permission that neither was able to withdraw from the other. He received 7 Academy Award nominations without winning, a record for actors at the time, for work that included Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? In 1966, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold in 1965, and Anne of the Thousand Days in 1969. Richard Burton died on August 5, 1984 in Séligny, Switzerland, at the age of 58 from a cerebral hemorrhage. He had been largely sober for several years before his death. Number 4. Humphrey Bogart. Humphrey Bogart was, by the testimony of nearly everyone who worked with him, a functional alcoholic of remarkable consistency. He drank from the time he woke up until the time he went to sleep. maintained a blood alcohol level that would have been incapacitating for most people, and delivered performances of precise technical quality while doing so, a combination that his colleagues found genuinely baffling and that his directors eventually accepted as simply how Bogart operated. Born Humphrey DeForest Bogart in New York City on December 25, 1899, he came from a prosperous family. His father was a physician, his mother a commercial illustrator, and served briefly in the United States Navy during World War I before finding his way into theater through connections that his family background provided. His film career began in the early 1930s and was primarily populated by villains and supporting roles until High Sierra in 1941 and The Maltese Falcon the same year established him as a leading man of the First Order. Casablanca in 1942 to Have and Have Not in 1944, during the filming of which he met Lauren Bacall, who was 19 and became his fourth wife. The Big Sleep in 1946, The African Queen in 1951, for which he won the Academy Award for Best Actor. These are the productions that define his screen career, and all of them were made with Bogart maintaining his customary level of alcohol consumption throughout. On The African Queen, filmed on location in the Belgian Congo and Uganda, the entire cast and crew were suffering from dysentery caused by contaminated water. Bogart and director John Huston, who shared Bogart's drinking habits, avoided the illness entirely. Both attributed their survival to the fact that they had been drinking whiskey consistently enough that nothing biological could survive the environment they had created. His personal manner, direct, frequently combative, immune to the social requirements of Hollywood's more ceremonial occasions, was itself alcohol-adjacent. He founded a social group called the Rat Pack with Frank Sinatra and a rotating membership of companions whose primary qualification was a willingness to drink seriously and stay up late. Humphrey Bogart died on January 14, 1957 in Holmby Hills, California, at the age of 57 from esophageal cancer. He had continued working almost until the end. Number 3. Spencer Tracy. Spencer Tracy's drinking was, by the testimony of his directors, his co-stars, and his long-term partner, Katharine Hepburn, the defining operational challenge of working with him across 3 decades of film production. It was not social drinking. It was not heavy drinking in the ordinary sense. It was alcoholism of a severity that produced complete disappearances, required medical intervention on multiple occasions, and forced the studios that employed him to build contingency planning into every budget and every schedule. Born on April 5, 1900 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Tracy had come to film through theater and built a reputation for technical naturalism that made him the benchmark against which other actors were measured. His 2 Academy Awards for Captains Courageous in 1937 and Boys Town in 1938 established him at the top of the industry's hierarchy, a position his work sustained, even as his drinking made him an increasingly difficult production asset to manage. The specific mechanics of the problem were well documented by the people who worked around it. Tracy's binges could last for days or weeks. During those periods, he was genuinely unreachable, not merely unavailable in the way a busy star might be, but gone, in the specific sense of someone who had removed himself from contact and accountability entirely. Studios tracked him through intermediaries, directors waited, producers reconfigured shooting schedules around his absence and his return. What made the situation sustainable, from the industry's perspective, was the quality of his work when he was present. Directors who had spent days waiting for him described the experience of watching him work. The concentration, the economy, the specific quality of attention he brought to a scene, as unlike anything they had seen from anyone else. John Ford, who directed him in Northwest Passage in 1940 during a period of acute drinking difficulty, said that Tracy was the finest actor he had ever worked with and one of the hardest. Katharine Hepburn, who was with him from 1941 until his death, and who was herself a teetotaler, managed his drinking with a combination of patience, practicality, and genuine love that the people around them described as the central relationship of both their lives. Spencer Tracy died on June 10, 1967, in Beverly Hills, California, at the age of 67. Number 2. Peter O'Toole. Peter O'Toole was honest about his drinking in a way that most of his contemporaries were not. He discussed it in interviews without apology or excessive self-flagellation, acknowledged the damage it had done to his body and his relationships with a directness that was either admirable or disarming depending on the interviewer's disposition, and continued acting to a standard that made his physical survival seem implausible in the most productive possible sense. Born Peter Seamus O'Toole in Connemara, Ireland on August 2, 1932, though some sources list Leeds, England, where he was raised, as his birthplace. He trained at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in London, alongside Albert Finney and other members of a generation that transformed British theatre and film in the late 1950s and early 1960s. His stage work at the Bristol Old Vic and with the Royal Shakespeare Company established him as a performer of the first rank, before Lawrence of Arabia in 1962 made him a global star. Lawrence of Arabia was filmed across multiple locations in Jordan, Morocco, and Spain over a period stretching from 1960 to 1962. And O'Toole's drinking during that production is documented in accounts from crew members and fellow cast members. Director David Lean, who was demanding in conditions that would have tested anyone's composure, found O'Toole's behavior challenging and the performances he delivered extraordinary, a combination that characterized the relationship between O'Toole and his directors consistently across his career. He received 8 Academy Award nominations without winning, the most nominations without a win in Oscar history. At the time, he received an honorary award in 2003 for work including Lawrence of Arabia, Beckett in 1964, The Lion in Winter in 1968, and My Favorite Year in 1982, the last of which used his reputation for drinking directly as the premise of the film. He played a fictional version of Errol Flynn, a dissolute, charming, drinking screen legend hired to appear on a live television program, with the specific authority of someone drawing on material he knew firsthand. He had major surgery in 1976 to remove most of his pancreas and part of his stomach, a consequence of his drinking that his doctors told him would kill him if he continued. He reduced his drinking substantially and lived another 37 years. Peter O'Toole died on December 14, 2013, in London at the age of 81. Number 1. Dean Martin. Dean Martin's drinking was, for most of his career, a performance. He cultivated the image of the permanently lubricated Rat Pack entertainer, the glass of scotch always in hand, the slightly unfocused grin, the casual slurring that suggested a man who had been at the bar since noon, with the same professional precision that he applied to his singing and his comic timing. People who worked with him consistently reported that the glass contained apple juice. The persona was constructed and maintained as carefully as any role he played. Born Dino Paul Crocetti in Steubenville, Ohio, on June 7, 1917, Martin had worked as a card dealer, a steel mill worker, and a boxer before finding his way into singing at local clubs and eventually onto the circuit that brought him to New York and to Jerry Lewis. His partnership with Lewis, which ran from 1946 to 1956, made both of them famous. Martin as the handsome, relaxed straight man to Lewis's anarchic physical comedy, a combination that worked because Martin's ease was real and his timing was exact. His solo film career after the Lewis partnership ended produced work of consistent quality. Some came running in 1958, Rio Bravo in 1959, The Young Lions in 1958. That demonstrated a range the comedy partnership had not fully showcased. The Rat Pack films of the early 1960s, Ocean's 11 in 1960, Sergeant's 3 in 1962, were made with a deliberate looseness that the drinking persona served directly. In his later years, however, the performance of drinking became something closer to the reality. After the death of his son, Dean Paul Martin, in a military plane crash in March 1987, Martin withdrew from public life and, by multiple accounts, began drinking in earnest in a way that had not characterized the earlier decades. He gave fewer interviews, canceled engagements, and appeared in public less frequently. He was diagnosed with acute respiratory failure caused by lung cancer in 1995. Dean Martin died on December 25, 1995, in Beverly Hills, California, at the age of 78, Christmas Day, the same day W.C. Fields had died 49 years earlier. The drinking in Hollywood's golden age was not hidden the way other things were hidden. It was managed, accommodated, scheduled around, and in some cases celebrated as part of the persona. The studios built bars on their lots and supplied them. The industry's social life ran on alcohol the way other industries run on coffee. What distinguished the people on this list was not that they drank in an industry that drank, but that they drank at a volume and consistency that became the operating condition of their professional lives. Some of them produced their finest work in that condition. Some were destroyed by it. Most managed something complicated in between. Careers of genuine achievement built on foundations that their bodies eventually could not sustain. If this kind of Hollywood history is what brings you here, hit that like button and subscribe. There is a lot more coming.